So what's the process for Texas immigration? How do we get Anglo-American immigrants into the country? Well, it's done through a system called the impresario system. And who are impresarios? These are individuals who are responsible for bringing in Anglo-American families into Texas and having them settle on land, or actually, selling the land to them. Okay, and these impresarios were Americans, such as Stephen Austin and his dad, Moses Austin. They were responsible for bringing in American families. So, for example, here, Stephen Austin was responsible for bringing in about 300 American families just in the first year alone. Okay, so it was these impresarios who were helping to bring in the Anglo-American immigrants into Texas, right? They had a deal with the Mexican government to do this. And so what were the benefits of immigration, right? Why would Anglo-Americans want to move to Spanish Texas or Mexican Texas instead of staying in the United States? Well, for one, the land was much cheaper. Okay, this was another incentive for these Anglo-American immigrants. So basically, you'd pay about 10 cents for 1 acre of land. Oh my goodness, that's very cheap, right? Very affordable, even at that time, right? So if you were in the United States and you want to get an acre of land, usually it costs about $1.25, right? And so it's a major price difference there, and that's an incentive for individuals who cannot afford land in the United States, right? So they could go to Texas and get a lot more land for a much cheaper price. Another big incentive for Anglo-American immigrants was a 7-year tax exemption. Okay, so if they immigrate to Mexico, they wouldn't pay taxes for 7 years. That would give them time to get on their feet, establish their farms, make a pretty good living, and then eventually they would begin paying taxes after those 7 years. And so this would bring in a large influx of Anglo-American immigrants into Texas, right? The impresarios would be responsible for bringing in these people and settling them on the plots of land that they bought. Okay, but there was some complaints coming from Mexican settlers there in Texas, and some of these complaints were not so much, living next to their Anglo-American neighbors, but it was because of a number of expeditions known as filibustering expeditions coming from the United States. What is a filibustering expedition? Basically, these are our expeditions that tried to come from the United States and take over Texas. So that it would eventually be annexed by the United States. So even before the Texas Rebellion and the independence movement there in Texas, you had individuals coming from the U.S. Trying to conquer Texas and take it from Mexico so that it would eventually be absorbed into the United States. One of the individuals who led these expeditions was a man named James Long. Coming from Tennessee, he would move into the area of Mississippi, and he put together an American force that would come into eastern Texas, and they tried to take over that portion of Texas, but eventually you would have Mexican soldiers come and put down that expedition. They would capture Long, and Long would be sent to Mexico City, where he would eventually be executed. But James Long, he was a serious threat there in Mexico for a period of time, right, causing a lot of trouble. And so this was one of the complaints from Mexican settlers, that they feared that the United States was eventually going to take over Texas. You had some Mexican settlers who did not want that. They wanted to stay aligned with Mexico, but eventually you would see that there were some Mexican settlers who were actually okay with the idea of gaining independence from Mexico, but this would be later when centralists gained control of the Mexican government. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, eventually, this whole project of bringing Anglo-Americans into Texas as immigrants would be so successful that you're going to actually have an excessive amount of American immigration into Texas. And it got to the point where Mexican officials were a little worried that all these Anglo-American immigrants were going to be a problem there in Texas, right? If they decided to rise up and start a rebellion and maybe try to join with the United States, this could be an issue because the American immigrants were heavily outnumbering the Mexican immigrants in Texas, right? There was much more of them. So you're starting to get this very large Anglo-American immigrant population in Texas, and so this is going to be seen as a threat to Mexican officials. And so you're going to see Mexican officials passing a number of laws to try to slow down or stop Anglo-American immigration into Texas. It was just too successful. Too many started coming because of the opportunity of buying all this cheap land. A number of these Anglo-American immigrants were slaveholders who came to Texas, brought their slaves with them, and started plantations. Okay, and that was their idea. They were going to make a profit off of that land that they bought for a very cheap price in Texas. And so many were slaveholders, had a large amount of slaves. And so when the Mexican president, Vicente Guerrero, abolishes slavery, which we talked about this a little bit before, when Guerrero abolished slavery, part of the reason he did this was to discourage Anglo-American immigration into Texas, because he was well aware that a lot of these Anglo-Americans who were coming to Texas had slaves, right? They're coming from the South, right? So they own slaves, and they're starting plantations there in Texas. So when President Guerrero abolishes slavery, this is meant to discourage them from wanting to come to Texas as they start to hear the news that, oh wait, slavery is not legal in Mexico anymore. Now, the abolition of slavery was not immediately enforced in Texas. Right, so you have a lot of slave owners there, and they weren't, forced to free their slaves by the Mexican government, and so for a period of time, Texas actually was exempted from the abolition of slavery in Mexico. All right, so you don't see them freeing their slaves. They were exempt from that law for a period of time, but it showed the direction that the Mexican government was moving in, and eventually, this is a warning sign to Anglo-American immigrants there in Texas that eventually slavery was going to be abolished there in Texas as well. Okay, and it was meant to discourage others from coming, other slaveholders from coming to Texas. Eventually, in 1830, you would see a law being passed that would end immigration coming from the United States, and this is the Colonization Law of 1830. Okay, so not only does the colonization law stop immigration, so no more Anglo-American immigrants could come into Texas, but also the colonization law meant to strengthen the Mexican garrisons that were there in Texas. What is a Mexican garrison? We're talking about military outposts. Okay, they needed to be strengthened because now that there's this large Anglo-American presence there in Texas, if there was an uprising, Mexican military has to be prepared for that. Okay, so the colonization law of 1830 is supposed to strengthen those Mexican military outposts, those garrisons. The colonization law also called for better economic connections with the rest of Mexico. Okay, so Texas is on the fringes of the country, right, in the Northern Territory, and so it was somewhat isolated from the economy of the rest of Mexico. And so the colonization law hoped to integrate Texas economically with the rest of the country, and so it proposed expanding trade coming from Texas along the Gulf Coast, connecting with the rest of Mexico. Right? When you have a country, you want to make sure that all aspects of the economy are integrated, right? That they're working together, that you have trade expanding to various different markets in your country. You don't want one area to be isolated, right? Especially if you're trying to maintain your grasp on that area and it doesn't have a large population. Right? And so that brings us to the next aspect of the colonization law of 1830, and that is to promote more colonization coming from Mexico and not from the United States. Okay, and so you can see here that Mexico is changing its policies. It's moving away from U.S. immigration and trying to get more Mexican settlers from Mexico to migrate up north into Texas, right? So that there would be a larger Mexican population. I mean, you still have a lot of Anglo-American settlers who are going to live there in Texas, but Mexico is simply stopping the immigration coming from the U.S. so that there wouldn't be more citizens. So you still have this large Anglo-American population, and so Mexico wants to balance that out by promoting Mexican colonization of Texas, right? Trying to get more settlers coming from Mexico to live there in Texas.